Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am Daren, Jaime, and if you're asking the question, what is this show about? Well, we take a look at a lot of the inequities that people face. We promote civic engagement. We get different points of view with some great informative guests, and we bring you the information that matters. So we encourage you to stay with us right now as the Social Justice Forums begins right away. And welcome back. The hashtag Less is More campaign celebrates the first anniversary of the Less is More Act. After being signed into law by Governor Kathy Hochul, the act has made a transformative impact on tens of thousands of New Yorkers in the parole system. Joining us now is the Director of Community Organizing at the Katal Center for Equity, Health, and Justice, Kenyatta Muzzanni. And Kenyatta, thank you so much for being with us again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Super excited.
Yeah, so 1 year later, and we talk about 1 year later, less is more, and we've seen some progress, huh?
Yeah, we've seen a bit of progress. And I think it's helpful if I also just start out with what Less is More New York does before moving into progress, just to help people get acclimated. So hashtag Less is More New York, it's our campaign, and it is the most transformative parole bill across the country. What it does is there are four major provisions, and the first is that it restricts the use of incarceration for technical parole violations, which is really critical. The second is that it eliminates automatic detention based on a mere accusation of a technical violation. The third is that it bolsters due process. And the fourth is that it provides an earned time credit, also known as 30 for 30, which helps people who are doing well off parole get off parole earlier, which just keeps them in their community. And it has been a whirlwind of a year. The bill was signed into law last year on September 17th, 2021. And since then, we have just seen a dramatic change in the parole system across New York State. To date, with Less is More New York, we've actually reduced the entire community supervision population by more than 40% in New York.
Wow.
And so 40%, like, what does that mean in real numbers and in humans? It means that more than 13,000 people have been discharged from parole. That are, like you named, like tens of thousands of people. But if you look at like their families, their loved ones, entire community, that are millions of people across New York whose lives have been dramatically improved because of Less is More New York. And oddly enough, that's not the only thing that's happened. Because of the provisions of Less is More New York, we've actually also been able to reduce the number of people who are held in local jails by nearly 90% across New York. And more than 1,500 people have actually been released from jails and prisons across the state. So it has been a really wild ride of a year. And so many people have just been positively impacted by Less is More.
Yeah, and so when we talk about 13,000 people, that's no number to snuff at. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. But since we're talking about where things were before, talk about the difference between before and now, because obviously a lot of families, a lot of individuals have actually been impacted. But this has definitely been, in many ways, a weight and a burden that's been lifted off of so many people.
Yes, it really has. New York pretty much led the entire country for incarcerating people for technical violations. And in 2019, roughly a third of all people who were admitted to state jails were there just for technical violations of parole. And that just really shows you how embedded incarceration due to parole violations were really taking front and center, unfortunately, in New York. And so the situation was just incredibly dire, where there were just thousands of people who were on parole. And now we've seen this 40% reduction where 13,000 people have been discharged. And this, again, is only in the first year. The impacts of Less is More New York will continue to be felt for a very long time. And it has just radically changed the entire parole system to what it was pre-pandemic, and even right up until the bill was signed.
Right. And so even though we've seen this in terms of parole, I know that there were still some things people are trying to see with regards to with parole reform. This is huge. But if I talk to some people, they say there's still more that needs to be done. Do you agree?
Absolutely. This is Less is More New York is a step in the right direction, and it is the absolute necessary step to just keep up with New York being a leader when it comes to criminal justice reform. But there were other provisions and parole reform bills that were left on the table last session, and those included elder parole, fair and timely parole. And so there is still a lot of more work that does need to be done for the entire parole system. And less is more New York is still one step in the right direction to make sure that we have some semblance of justice for people who have been impacted by this and the larger community. I think the thing for me that's also really that has stood out since we've done the Less is More New York campaign is how impactful it is, not only on the people who have been on parole, but also their loved ones and people in their community who care. And so in the same way that Less is More New York has had, this major impact, we want to keep and continue that trend and make sure that the other parole bills are not just left on the table and that we're steering New York in this direction towards actual and legitimate criminal justice reform.
Yeah. And so for yourself, I mean, the work continues, and give us a little bit about what you've been doing these days.
We're working on implementation. That is what the Less is More New York Coalition has done. And ever since September 17th, we signed it into law, and it got signed into law, and it was an amazing moment. And we all took time to pause and celebrate and just recharge. But now the nitty-gritty work of implementation is upon us. And so where we stand now, it's been a full year since the bill has been signed into law. The entire time since then, we've been working on make sure that the bill is implemented as the law states, make sure people know their rights. And so even though we are now at a place where all of the provisions of the bill have been fully implemented, we're continuing to work with our defenders across the state who have been working with their clients who have been impacted by parole. We're continuing to work with our members who have been impacted by parole to make sure that they know what their laws are, they know what the new law is, make sure their communities know what the law is. And we're continuing to protect the bill. I think we've seen the impact of criminal justice reform at large in New York State. And so we're continuing to shore up our work to make sure that Less is More New York is protected and that it's implemented correctly.
So when the bill was signed into law, some people always ask the question about how long does it take before we see immediate implementation, things happening right away. How long was it before you were actually able to see the law actually take effect from the time that the governor signed it in?
Well, one of the unique things that happened when Less is More New York was signed into law is that Governor Kathy Hochul immediately discharged over 100 people on Rikers Island who were held for technical parole violations. And so that was an amazing thing that was done. It was exactly within the limits of the law for her to do. And we saw that immediate change of people going back into their communities. Subsequent to that, though, most of the provisions of the law went into effect in March of 2022. So we had that period of time in between September of 2021 and then March of 2022. And then we had to wait and then most of the provisions went into effect until September 1st. So we were able to see some immediate changes with the bill and immediate, I should say, impact with Less is More, but there was still some time that we did have to wait. And we continued to do everything we could to make this as a smooth of a process for everyone as we could.
Yeah. For someone who's on parole, I think that many times we just hear the word parole, but people don't always understand what's associated with that. For instance, curfew. People know about that. But what are some of the challenges that a person incurs while being on parole? Because while this bill has taken effect and helped those who are on it, so many people are not aware of what happens when a person is on parole.
Correct. So I can share a little bit about what happens with a person now that Less is More New York is law if they're on parole versus what would have happened to them prior to the bill. So prior to the law being implemented. So now let's say you're on parole and you are still technically under the custody of the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. You mentioned curfew. I won't use that example, but let's say you have to check in for your parole. And so you got off of work, you're trying to get on the C train, you're trying to go uptown, and the train is late. How often have all of us been on the train and it's just been delayed in the station? If you were on parole and you were late for your meeting with your parole officer prior to Less is More New York, that would constitute a technical violation that you could have been incarcerated for. So people who are on parole often have to face harsher stipulations than people who are not on parole. And if I was a few minutes late to a doctor's appointment or a few minutes late to a meeting with my supervisor, okay, I wouldn't have to be fearful of showing up to that appointment and knowing that I may be 30 minutes late or even more because of the train and fearing for incarceration. And so most people don't recognize that people who are on parole have so many stipulations. Thankfully, because of Less is More New York, situations like that won't necessarily happen anymore. But there are other things and stipulations that people on parole have to do, and it's individualized. Usually your parole officer hands you a set of stipulations. There may be some common ones, but usually that is a conversation between the person on parole and their parole officer. But they are often on stipulations that are just a lot harsher than if they were not on parole.
Can you give me a little idea as to where we stand as far as New York State's parole system compared to other states around the country?
Correct. So prior to Less is More New York, like I said, we were terrible when it comes to incarcerating people. And our partners over at the Commission and the Justice Lab put out a report in 2021 on the cost of incarceration, the enormous cost. And New York came at the #1 worst place for incarcerating people for technical violations. And even prior to Less is More, a few years earlier, the Bureau of Justice Statistics put out a report that ranked New York as being #1 for demanding that people on parole go into incarceration for drug treatment. And we have been just the worst in the country with parole reform. So I would say stay tuned in the next few weeks for just hearing updates on the Less is More New York coalition and campaign around where we now stand now that we have been a year out with Less is More. And folks can always check that out on our campaign website, which is lessismoreny.org. And I also wanted to point out that on our website, instead of hearing from me, you can directly hear from people who have been on parole or who have loved ones who are on parole about their experiences and their stories about Less is More New York. So if you go on our campaign website, lessismoreny/stories, you can click on that stories tab and just read a few read from people who have been on parole or their loved ones are on parole about the impact that this law has had on them.
Yeah, I was going to drill down a little bit more on that one, because when we talk about the individual, that's one thing, but then share with us a little bit about that family component, because when a person is incarcerated, we've often said the family's in incarceration. When a person's on parole, the same thing happens. It seems as though families are also on parole because they share in that person's struggle.
Absolutely. Throughout the entire Less is More New York campaign, we heard from people who were on parole and their loved ones, their immediate family or family members who were taking care of them, horror stories about the fear that they had just for technical parole violations. Stories of people who their partner was having a medical procedure and they had to choose between going out and potentially missing their curfew or having to miss a very important life moment with their family member, whether that was a procedure or whether that was even a family member having a baby or having something else happen to them. We heard of grandparents who are stuck in this cycle of raising their grandkids because their children are either on parole and maybe incarcerated, or their children, meaning the parents of the grandchildren, may have certain stipulations where they can't always visit their family members or spend that time because of how harsh their parole sentences are. Now with Less is More, we have heard from our members and their family members about how the situation is totally different. They're able to travel to see their families a little more because they don't necessarily have the fear of incarceration. They're able to not get concerned if they're a few minutes late because they were at their kids' event at school or a summer event and the train is running a few minutes late. They don't have that fear anymore. And I think when you pointed out and said that when someone is on parole, really the entire family is on parole, that's the insidious nature of the criminal legal system, the criminal justice system that we all have to operate in. It's never just an individual is on community supervision or an individual has been impacted by the criminal justice system. It has an impact on the entire family, and that in turn has an impact on the entire community. And what we have seen throughout the Less is More New York campaign is that communities have shown up. Communities know the impact that this is going to have. And so we have everyone on this campaign, from grandparents to parents to children to young people, who know the impact that incarceration and community supervision have, not just only on their immediate family, but in the families of their friends and loved ones as well.
Kenyatta, can you tell me when it comes to those persons that have been, released from parole and the fact of this parole reform, the work doesn't stop there, because even though you're off parole, there's still another layer of transition that has to occur. What kind of resources are available for those persons after their parole has been their time with parole has been up?
That's a really good question. So one of the critical things for us in working on the Less is More New York campaign is that we worked with an entire coalition that included some of the family members that I named earlier, And it also included direct service providers. And those direct service providers spanned housing, employment opportunities, educational opportunities, so many different direct service providers, public defenders, we even mentioned. So we've been working with those direct service providers and with those other groups to make sure that they were embedded in the coalition, and to make sure that we could always reach out to them and say, hey, now that Less is More New York is signed into law and it's implemented, what resources do you have? What extra support do you have to support people who may be discharged, former clients that may have been on your caseload who will not be on your caseload? Start that process of the transition to help them back into their community. And so we've continued to make sure that we meet with different service providers, bring them into the fold with what Less is More New York is doing, especially now that it is law, and to make sure that we provide supports for people. And I think it's also a time for us to continue investing in new supports as a state, because we have a lot of resources, and especially in a city like New York, there are so many resources, but there's so many needs that people have. And so if we could just continue to invest in our communities even further to provide different types of supports for people, additional supports for people, making those connections for people who may be on a caseload and feel like, I'm just on this caseload, but what is it really doing? Make those deeper connections and investments to get more resources that we need. We are saving the state on average $680 million every year for no longer arresting and incarcerating people for technical parole violations. And that is a huge amount of money. So just want to name that. We can continue to do more.
Yeah. So for people who want to be able to partner with you in the work that you're doing, somebody who wants to, lend their voice, or maybe they have a family member that is on parole or getting off of parole, how do they get in contact, and what do they need to do?
Absolutely. So definitely go onto our campaign website, lessismoreny.org. From there, you'll be able to see different ways that you can get involved and take action. You can, like I was sharing earlier, if you have a story of how Less is More New York has impacted you, you can definitely share that. And I know that this is specific to the Bronx, but our organization and our allies are all throughout New York. So if you happen to come across this video and you've lived, let's say in, Binghamton, and you're like, man, I want to get involved in this. I know someone on parole. I'm on parole. We definitely have ways that everybody can take part in this. So go to lessismoreny.org and you'll be able to take action with us.
All right. Kenyatta, Muzzanni, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for this information. Great to hear the work and the progress that's been made over the course of the past year. And as you said, still much work needs to be done. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
All righty. We're going to take a quick break here on the Social Justice Forums, and we'll be back in a moment. And welcome back. The Legal Aid Society recently released a new database that's allowing New Yorkers to look up the disciplinary records of police officers that they encounter. Now, the organization hopes to make accountability and transparency more accessible to the public, particularly to communities of color. Joining us now is the supervising attorney of the Legal Aid Society, Anthony Posada. And Anthony, thank you for joining us. And I'll start off with, why do you feel that this database is so important?
Thank you again, Daren, for having me. And you're right. We recently launched what is perhaps the most comprehensive database of police officer records, as well as records of Department of Correction officers, that will allow members of the public to check for disciplinary records, as well as records of payroll of officers that are patrolling their communities. And this is something that goes to the heart of being able to develop trust in the police, develop trust in the public servants who swore to protect people in their communities. And also, it does away with what was a norm for a very long time, where these records were shielded from the public eye. And so having this database is something that is going to be of service to the community, so that people can know and have a better understanding of the kinds of officers that are patrolling their streets.
So when we talk about officers patrolling the streets, obviously a lot of people do have encounters with police officers. Sometimes those encounters do not go the best way. And many times that interaction with the police officer may be the first of its kind, but for that officer, they may have multiple encounters with people that are worth noting about. Give us a little bit about this here, because for a person that has this on an individual encounter, to be able to uncover now that this person, this police officer, may have had multiple encounters and it was in a negative fashion, how does that bolster a person's case?
Well, that in itself is something that will help. Let's say if the person develops or finds themselves with a criminal case against them, resulting from that encounter. If they get a hold of these records, if their public defender gets these records and is able to see them, then that is going to be able to chip away at the credibility of the officer when it comes to their testimony in court, because it will show that there's a pattern of the behavior already in the person's past and in the officer's interactions with people. And so this will help the person in their primary case. But overall, if a person has an encounter, they deserve to know if this officer already has exhibited this kind of behavior that has resulted in disciplinary charges being filed against them, so that they can understand that this is not a first instance, it's not an isolated instance. It could be something that's already been happening in the career of this officer. And so it allows the person to see the paper trail of that history and have access to it. And so those are some of the different ways, Daren, that having this information at your fingertips can help with their primary case.
Give me a little bit about the numbers that you're seeing coming across your desk in terms of complaints. Are we seeing a rise in complaints by civilians when it comes to police?
Well, what I can tell you, Daren, is what the database includes. It combines more than 450,000 records. It has over 18,000 lawsuits filed against more than 14,000 NYPD officers in a time frame that encompasses 2013 up until June 30 of 2022, this year. It has 190,000 civilian complaint review board records of allegations made against NYPD officers, including more than 1,000 full investigation closing reports, roughly 9,000 NYPD internal misconduct records, including NYPD trial decisions, and NYPD Internal Affairs Bureau records, as well as 15,000 district attorney and judicial records that include what we refer to in criminal justice as Brady and Giglio disclosures from prosecutors and district attorney adverse credibility records from 4 New York City counties. So in that last part, Brady material is exculpatory material that the prosecutors have that must be provided to public defenders. And so it also has over 1,000 archived media articles concerning NYPD misconduct and hundreds of Department of Corrections staff discipline records. So it's not so much, Daren, that we're seeing a rise in people making up these complaints or filing these complaints, but it's really about the thoroughness of the database and the way that brings together from all these multiple sources the informations that can start to give a person a clear understanding of the officers and their actual histories.
And so we talk about the Cop Accountability Project. I want to talk about that for a few moments because that's another component here. When we talk about the Cop Accountability Project, what exactly is that and what are your hopes?
And start telling you that the law enforcement lookup tool, which is the name of the database that was released this week, LALU is the acronym. It is the result of a pilot project that started with a public database that was called CapStat. And that was started in 2018. And the idea behind it was in the years prior to the launching of this database, public defenders would have these records in spreadsheets, in notes that they would take of instances where officers were found to be not credible or where they would receive material about an officer's disciplinary records. But there wasn't a systematic way to access that information. It was spread out, it was held by different people. And so the CopStat database, the pilot project, was a way in which to start organizing and putting an infrastructure over that information and making it available in a digital format. Since then, the Cop Accountability Project has grown to be a project that assists members of the public if they find themselves in situations like the one we mentioned earlier, where somebody has an encounter with a police officer and they want to file a complaint, but they don't know how to, and they want to understand how they can preserve their rights in case they want to file a lawsuit against the city and that officer in the future. And so there's a current clinic that operates as a result of the Cop Accountability Project, as well as the project itself is involved in lawsuits that the Legal Aid Society currently has against the NYPD for instances where its officers violated people's rights. And one example I can give you of that, Daren, is a lawsuit we have against the city related to the way in which officers violated people's rights during the George Floyd protests in 2020. Many people there saw the violent images that were on social media of officers pushing people, injuring people, using police vehicles against them when they were peacefully protesting and engaging in tactics that were meant to really silence and deter people from exercising their right to protest. And so the Cop Accountability Project operates in those different spheres, in bringing forward litigation and working in coalitions to hold officers accountable and work towards reforms that will ensure that the way the laws are written are protecting people and making sure that the police are more accountable. And the LALU itself, the database, is a way of legitimizing these accountability systems because if there is a disciplinary process against an officer, if there is a civilian complaint review board complaint that was substantiated, this database now brings all of that information together so people can access it and see it, as opposed to it just remaining secret or hidden from the public eye.
What kind of response have you been getting since the database has been released and now people have access to this information? Obviously, this is something that people have been calling for a long period of time, but now to see it actually out and available, what's it been like?
There's been a very positive response from the public. A lot of the comments relate to how this is going to help with transparency, how having these records is something we should have been doing a long time ago. And there are people who criticize it, people who come to viewing it as something that is actually meant to harm officers, but that's a clear misunderstanding, Daren, because again, the intent here is not to use this database in any way that puts people in jeopardy. It's really about, these are documents that show a person's history. They're already going to be, they're made public. And so if you have nothing to hide, if you're doing what you were sworn and took an oath to do, then there's not really anything that's putting you in jeopardy here. So there have been those types of comments about it, but those are really in the minority.
Yeah. And what about law enforcement? I mean, obviously, I know they're not too happy with this. Have you got any kind of legal pushback here?
I'd have to check, Daren, although I wouldn't be surprised if there was a statement from the police officers union saying that, again, having these records is dangerous for officers or will prevent them from doing their job effectively, which is actually doesn't make really sense, because if officers are doing their job correctly, then they should have nothing to worry about in this database. And there obviously have been people who say things like, well, why not have everybody's criminal histories publicly available? But again, Daren, we're having a space for people to know about public servants, people who are in a different footing in terms of civilians, because, right, they are here to do their jobs as police officers.
So if a person wants to go about getting this database and they're just seeing this show for the very first time and they're hearing about this, what do they do?
So they can go to www.legal-aid.org/LELU, L-E-L-U. And that will take them directly to the website where they can find the database. Again, that's www.legal-aid.org/LELU. And that takes them directly to the database. And the way it was set up is that you can type in an officer's name and begin to search across all these different fields. And just the name itself is how people can find information, and not necessarily a badge number, because badge numbers, we have found out, change throughout an officer's career. And so the name itself is the identifier that follows the person's documents.
Well, Anthony, I want to thank you for taking the time to share with us today. And certainly, I know the public will definitely take advantage of this much needed resource here in the community. And we'll see where it goes from here. Anthony Posada, thank you very much for sharing with us.
Thank you very much for having me, Daren. And if people have any questions, they can get in contact with us and also reach out to us even through that website itself. And thank you again for having us and letting us talk about this important tool.
Absolutely. Anthony Posada, thank you for being with us. And that takes the time for this segment, but we want you to stay with us, because guess what? The Social Justice Forum continues with another guest right after this.
We built a media network for you.
BronxNet TV.
Come learn in your new state-of-the-art studios at Lehman College.
At Mercy College.
And coming soon to the South Bronx in the Hub.
Inspire with your stories, culture, history.
Your Bronx on BronxNet.
Engage with us.
Connect with us at your channels and at BronxNet.tv.
Learn, engage, inspire. BronxNet TV.
From the Bronx
to the world.
BronxNet.
Welcome back to the show. Exodus Transitional Community is an organization delivering innovative programming tailored to the community affected by the justice system and advocates for a society in which all can achieve social, economic, and spiritual well-being. And joining me now, we're pleased to have the Associate Vice President of Workforce Development Programs at Exodus Transitional Community, Brittany Smith. And Brittany, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I gave our viewers a little bit of insight into some of the things that Exodus does, but I'm sure you could do a little bit better job. So for those who may not be so familiar with Exodus Transitional Community, give us a little bit more.
Sure. So Exodus Transitional Community was founded in 1999, and since that time, we've grown exponentially. And our focus and our drive has really been to better support our community in various ways. Currently, our work has been very expansive, and it looks like a holistic reentry program where we are focusing not only on the workforce development pieces, but so much more. So our goal overall is to how do we provide trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive care to individuals coming home from incarceration and to the community to ensure that they can move forward and make progress in their lives. So for instance, our programs include kind of a triage intake program where you come in and you tell us kind of what your needs are, what you're going through, and what you're seeking from us. And we figure out what are the best ways to connect you to the resources that we have internally and potentially externally. And some of those resources are going through our job readiness training program, which is called Walking Through the Wilderness, working with the team, doing this soft skills workshop that allows us to help you address maybe some of the questions regarding gaps in a resume, how to answer the criminal history question that we do know has changed drastically due to the Fair Chance Act in New York. However, we want to make sure that we're preparing our individuals, how to write a resume, how to create a professional email, mock interview skills, and other soft skills to really help individuals along their pathway. And as part of that process, they sign an Exodus contract, and that contract really focuses on several key areas of a person's life to help them build their goals out. So it's not just a focus on, what are your economic goals or your job goals or career goals, but what are your personal goals? What are your spiritual goals? What are your goals for your family? What are your goals for your mental and physical health? And through that, we use that to tailor our services to each individual. And so if you come to us and you have an open case, we refer individuals internally to our Alternatives to Incarceration program to keep people out of the prison system. If you have a history of substance use, we are connecting individuals with our wellness program. If you have a diagnosed mental health disorder, we are connecting you with our Genesis Center. If you are, like all people, just experiencing trauma, we also connected to our Center for Trauma Innovation, which really also just emphasizes the fact that all people experience trauma, and you don't need a mental health diagnosis to have experienced trauma. So how can we better support individuals as they go through that? And with all of that, we are also on the front lines of doing powerful advocacy work to change the systems that continue to incarcerate our community.
So when a person walks through your door, obviously they have a variety of different services that they can really latch on to and be able to be serviced. But when you see the needs right now, particularly coming out of COVID and where we are right now, are you finding a particular trend amongst people who are coming through your door?
I think the largest trend is homelessness. I think we are seeing it across the city, and we know that this has been kind of a consistent issue within New York City, as there's a housing shortage, but you have individuals who are coming home from long incarceration periods who, don't have the foundational documents usually needed to, move directly into apartment, and there's still discrimination in housing. And so we are actually, one of our advocacy efforts is for fair chance in housing, similar to fair chance in employment, to ensure that people are able to get sustainable housing. Because the reality is, without that kind of key piece, it's really hard to do all of the other things. It's hard to, get a job if you don't know where you're sleeping every night, or if you have no place to shower and change your clothes. It's hard to focus on your education and go back to school if you don't know, again, that you'll be on a train or on a park bench the night before. So that is definitely one of the largest challenges. And during the COVID period, we were the partner that worked with the city for the emergency housing program to help reduce the population on Rikers and also support individuals from coming home. And so we've been managing those hotels since that time, and we are actively working to transition individuals into permanent housing. And one of the things that we're also actively seeking is how do we connect to, supportive housing, because even if we get permanent housing, some of our individuals need continuous care, and how do we make sure they stay connected to support?
Yeah, I know that you work with those with the area of reentry, and that's a big issue as well. Are those persons who are coming in for reentry, are we finding that they're particularly stable when it comes to housing, or are they in much need of housing services too?
They're also in much need of housing services. It's kind of a mixed bag. Some individuals have great family support, but they do want to be on their own. Right? They've been in a prison for a long time. They've shared cells. They've been in the space that has not been their own. So even going in the family home sometimes is not, the option that they want as their long-term plan. And so we do find that there's still barriers for those individuals that are related to a number of things. Some of it is as simple as not simple, but credit, right? How they may not have never built credit, and your credit score is always being run, or they have bad credit. From something that happened prior to their incarceration. They don't have any rental history because they've always been on someone else's lease, or they don't have enough money for a first month's rent Insecurity. And again, back to connecting it to employment, it's really hard to move into the employment piece without the housing piece, although we actively work to address both at the same time. And we actively work towards, ensuring people, when they are able and ready for housing, have the financial support through employment.
Yeah. We'll talk about youth for a moment because that's a critical component of our society, and so many times they lack the necessary resources as well. But I know that you do a great job of having an empowerment program that actually services them.
Yes, and I can say that the youth development program is one of my favorite parts of the work that we do because it really focuses on creating a safe environment where individuals can engage in pro-social behavior and really things that they want to do. So we have, our trauma-informed practices where our staff go through trauma-informed care training and various transformative trainings to ensure that as we engage with the youth, that we're recognizing some of the barriers and challenges that they're facing coming into our space. So we do programs that include transformative mentoring, a specific targeted job readiness approach just for youth, understanding their dynamics may look a little bit different than some of our reentry population, but also bringing in the fun things and the interesting things that they want to do. So for example, we have this phenomenal state-of-the-art music studio. We recognize that a lot of youth in our community are very, very interested in music. And many of them have used, let's say, not the best means to have access to paying for studio time. So one of the things that we want to ensure is that, as a means of engaging in the program, that they have access to this studio, which is an amazing studio. Like we have an engineer, full sound room, a booth. It is, it's fantastic. And we've had so much increase in individuals coming into the space. And while we have them, then we start to say like, okay, so let's think about things a little bit differently. Even as you're making your music, like we're not going to sit here and talk about the violence that's happening in the community and the violence that has been perpetuated, but how do we talk about changing even that narrative to something that's more positive? What are the things that you want to do and how do we drive that forward and use music as an outlet? But then also understanding that there's career pathways in music that's not necessarily related to being a performer. The engineers speak to them about what does it look like to become a music engineer? What does it look like to become a producer? What are the different opportunities for you to engage still in this space that you want and make a career out of it so that it's not just something to do right now. We're using it as a tool for deeper engagement.
Yeah. About GEDs, are you finding a lot of your students coming in need of GED assistance?
We are finding that participants are coming in need of assistance. And one of the things that occurs is, they haven't succeeded in traditional education settings for various reasons. Some of it due to undiagnosed learning disabilities. Unfortunately, our population have some of the highest percentages of undiagnosed learning disabilities. I think at one point I saw a statistic that said about 40% of individuals. So we do run GED classes to help individuals prepare to get their diploma. And we're also looking at, but we also have individuals who are currently in school who have requested tutoring within our youth department. So we also want to make sure that we're, advocating and supporting their tutoring needs. And we actually have a few students right now who are in college that I'm really excited about. One who went away to college and was like, well, if I'm back for winter break, like, can I come? And we're like, absolutely, you're always welcome here. We want you to feel that this is a place that you can always return to. So it's really powerful to see kind of the different dynamics and the way the individuals support and engage one another as well.
So as we look to the programs that you have, obviously they're of much need in our community. Obviously housing, and you talk about workforce development, you talk about young people. But give me this, because is there a need maybe that we're not paying attention to that you're seeing in your services that maybe we as a public need to be paying more attention to?
I think food insecurity is a big need that is under acknowledged within the community. We serve breakfast and lunch, and for the youth department who are here in the evening, we serve a meal later in the day. And we've seen an increase in the individuals who are coming to lunch services. And we're blessed to be able to, provide meals. But I think that as we talk about programming, it is a lot of the, what are we doing about violence interruption? And what are we doing to keep the people off the street? And what are we doing about drugs? And not recognizing that, with all of those things, there's still other challenges that these individuals are facing. And again, just similar to housing and having finances to support yourself. If you didn't eat this morning, it's really hard to spend your whole day focusing on a program. If you didn't eat this afternoon, or you're not going to eat later, it's hard to say that like, oh, this program is doing something for me, because you're not thinking about sometimes all of the social emotional support when you have very real physical needs. And so that's why it's very important. And anybody that comes in the door, when they walk in the door, one of the first questions we ask is, did you eat today? and we ensure that we provide the food. So I've had, individuals just walk in the door and say, can I have something to eat? And we're always say, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're working closely to try to address that for not just for our participants, but for the community. Our doors are open to the community. So a lot of people may see us as a reentry organization. But when lunch is served at 12 p.m., it's not just individuals who are enrolled in any of our programs. It's the community that also knows that they can walk in and get something to eat because they're hungry.
Brittany, I know that, COVID has had its set of challenges for the community. I think one of the things that we learned was that there was an increase, particularly amongst people because of a lack of socialization, things like that. So drug use, alcohol use seems to be prevalent, and people seem to be going binging is what one expert actually called it. What have you been able to see in terms of the services that you provided for those who are with substance abuse? Have we seen an increase?
So interestingly enough, I've been with Exodus for about 6 months, so I wasn't here during the full period of what we've seen. But from what I know in the work that has occurred, we did continue to connect individuals, and there was an increase in the connection to our wellness program, which is our substance use treatment program. Sorry, we're literally on 3rd Avenue.
It's okay.
So that's what you're hearing. But at the same time, we wanted to make sure that we were building and supporting in all of the programs, and that's really where the Center for Trauma Innovation came in, not just specifically looking at traditional types of trauma, but also looking at ways to engage people around trauma. So it's not just talk therapy, it's also how do we engage people in physical means of expressing their emotions. So we do like trauma-informed boxing, we've done improv, we have an open mic. And the goal for those were to really pull people out of that space of the heaviness of COVID and to keep them into positive spaces so that maybe we're not turning to the substance use. But if that was the case, it's always important, as we all know, to never demonize an individual, never kind of blame for what is happening, but figure out what the best pathway is for support. And so we've connected individuals to treatment continuously, and that's still our process right now.
Yeah. So for somebody who wants to take advantage of services, how do they qualify and what do they do?
They just come to the door, 2268 3rd Avenue. That's where our primary intake is done, and it's any open door for us. So if you come in through an alternative to incarceration program, if you come in through the Wellness Center, if you come in through the Center for Trauma Innovation, you have access to every program at Exodus. So while we do our primary, we have a team that does intakes there. Anywhere that you've engaged with any Exodus program, you're eligible for the other Exodus programs. And as I mentioned, yes, we're a reentry organization. Yes, we work with individuals who have been impacted by the carceral system, but we also understand that our community has a high percentage of individuals who may enter the carceral system. So as a preventative measure, we don't limit our services to individuals who have been impacted by the carceral system. If we can get you before you get to that point, we're happy to do that as well. So you can come in and still go through the job readiness training. You can come in, especially with our youth, right? It's all about prevention and not just the reactive measure and supporting individuals after any kind of contact with the carceral system. We want to do all of those things. So you can come in, speak to a case manager. Like I said, they'll ask you if you want something to eat. They'll ask you how you're doing today. They ask you if you have a place to sleep, and then they start putting together your individualized service plan and connecting you to the additional resources here at Exodus.
Yeah. Well, Brittany, some great resources that are available to the community, and thank you so much for sharing and the work that Exodus is doing, and glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Daren. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
All righty. Well, we want to thank you so much for being with us, and want to let you know, our viewers, unfortunately, we come to the end of our show today, and we hope that you did enjoy this week's discussion on the Social Justice Forum. Now, if you want to rewatch the edition, you can catch the recablecast on BronxNet TV. That's BronxNet.org as well. And then we invite you always to join in on the conversation, share your thoughts, your opinions. You can always go to our social media pages at BronxNet TV. Join us next week on another edition of the Social Justice Forums. There we will elevate the conversation, have some interesting dialogue, and some very informative guests. Until the next time we meet, I'm Daren Jaime saying take care and God bless.